UCLA, Dr. Taner Akjam, who is the inaugural director of the Armenian Genocide Project at UCLA for the Promise Institute. And he will be here to talk about the role and the decision-making involved in the Armenian Genocide. And we're inviting everyone to a reception between 6 and 7 p.m. out in the gallery area, where we'll have some food and refreshments, so come a little bit early. And then at 7 o'clock, we'll have our presentation by Dr. Taner Akjam, who is an excellent speaker, very interesting, and has a lot of new insight to share with us. That's on Friday, March the 3rd. On Friday nights, you do not need a parking pass or permit, so just feel free to come in anytime between 6 and 7, have something to eat, and join us for the lecture following that. The next week, we're doing something quite different. We're hosting a film screening, and this film is called Back to Ashtarag. Back to Ashtarag is a documentary by Tigran Nersisyan, who was born in Ashtarag. Ashtarag is a small town, not so much small anymore, but a town about 15 minutes to 20 minutes north of the city of Yerevan. And he will discuss his background. He will discuss his movie and about how he made the movie and why he made the movie. He left at a young age and then came back. He will be here along with the producer, who is Armen Karaolanyan. That will be on Friday, March the 10th. So we've got a lot of Friday nights if you would like to join us on Friday nights. Following that, on March the 26th is our Armenian Studies Program annual banquet. All of you are pretty much familiar with our program, that this is our 35th annual banquet. This year we're honoring two endowments, the Hamparsan Endowment and the new Ralph Papazian Endowment. Just again, the Ralph Papazian Endowment is for $700,000 and the Hamparsan Endowment is for $450,000. So within 2 months, the Armenian Studies Program really is very appreciative for these gifts, which will be in perpetuity. Long after we're all gone, this will still be helping Armenian students in the Armenian Studies Program. If you're interested in reservations, please see me afterwards and we'll be able to do that. Lots of events coming up. And then we're going to have an art exhibit in the university library. The artist Yervat Gojabashian, and it's going to be in the second floor ellipse. I have it on automatic, so it's kind of hard to go back. But it's called Gojabashian, Blessed Hands of the Armenian Heritage. And we're going to have a special opening for it on April the 13th in the library, but it will be open for a month, and so you can have an opportunity to go and see that. Yervat Gojabashian is a well-known painter and also sculptor, so we're going to have his works on display for 1 month. We still have more things coming up. Then on Friday, April 14th, the Cineculture program and Armenian Studies program are bringing the documentary Motherland, which has just been produced. Motherland is about the story of the Armenians, but about what's happening in Karabakh, about denial of genocide by the director, Vic Jarami. And we're going to have a virtual discussion because the class is a Zoom class. You'll be asked to watch the film in the week preceding and then join us on the Zoom for a discussion with the director. So that's how it's going to work. Next semester we'll be back in person, but we're doing that with them. And then one final, this is not the final event, but the final one I'll be talking about tonight. Dr. Christina Moranci, who is the Mashtots Professor of Armenian Studies at Harvard University, is going to give the inaugural lecture in a new series of talks that the Armenian Studies program is sponsoring on Armenian Christian art. And she is going to be the speaker. And that is going to be in the Smith Camp Alumni House, not in this venue, but in the Smith Camp Alumni House. And she will give the inaugural lecture. We're going to have a nice reception for that as well. So we ask you to join for that. Now that's kind of a lot of events in a few days, but they're really interesting, and we invite you to do that. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest who's going to introduce. He's not really a guest. He's the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities and the Haig and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies, my longtime colleague, Dr. Sergio Laporta, who is going to introduce our guest. Dr. Laporta, thank you.
Thank you, Barlow. thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you to the Knights and Daughters of Vartan for supporting this evening's lecture. This is a special honor for me to introduce Dr. Dennis Papazian, since I've known Dennis since I was a graduate student in Armenian studies, and from an early time when I began my studies, Dennis has been supportive of my going forward in that and of my work afterwards. So I'm really grateful to him, and I think a lot of people in the field today are grateful to Dr. Papazian because he really became a hallmark and I would say an ideal for us as scholars, because he was the first, I would say, of a generation of scholars to actually break beyond the ivory tower and not just see his work as for himself where he could be holed up in a library. He did do the research, but he was also very keen to communicate that research, not just to Armenians, although that was important to the Armenian community, but also to non-Armenians, and particularly influential non-Armenians, where he had incredible success in communicating Armenian issues to people in politics, to people in culture, to other fields in academia. We're probably most familiar with him, with his work as the founder and director of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. But as his book, From My Life and Thoughts, Reflections on an Armenian-American Journey shows, he was more than that. And even though that was more than enough, I think, for any one of us, that was enough for one life. It seems like Dennis lived 5 or 6 in his brief, youthful life. And for me, for example, I did not know that he was born in Augusta, Georgia, which explains why he's such an ace golfer. But he also played an important role in Cold War politics, has been in an airplane crash. Okay, great, because that's like a fantastic story where I found myself when I was reading this book at alternate times laughing out loud, other times shaking my head like this man should not still be here, and also shaking my head saying this is incredible that one person could do all this. So it is a real honor to be here with him tonight. He has been a guiding light in the field and for the Armenian population of America and the Republic of Armenia. His contributions have been incredible. And I'd also like to acknowledge his lovely and modest wife, Dr. Mary Papazian, who's also been a trailblazer as the president, most recently of San Jose State University, our sister campus, and has been a remarkable professor of English and a mentor to many people. So this is probably like the highest power couple in Armenian studies that we could bring here at this moment. So please give a warm welcome to both Dennis and Mary Papazian, and a heartfelt thanks for all that you both have done.
And I assume the mics are on? I need to turn it on. Oh, yeah. That's on. It's on, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say first, amazing programs, and I wish I could come to all of them. I'm gonna try, but I will say this: for those of you who are looking forward to next week's presentation by Taner Akjan, you need to stay till the end of tonight, so don't get bored, walk away halfway through, because they have a little story in here that Dennis will tell about bringing Taner Akjan to America. So it's something that's worth hearing. But I want to just turn it over to Dennis first and let him, he wants to say a few words, and then we'll get right into the meat of it.
Well, I hope that I get right into the meat of it right away. First, First, I want to thank the president who remarkably was the one who really was the first one to look at my book.
Excuse me, I think what we're going to do is shut off those mics and we're going to use this one.
Save all the
No, I don't know why it's wrong.
Yeah, they happen. It's technology. We love it.
There you go.
Yeah.
We're going to move this mic. It's not working. And we're going to move this mic and you can start over.
Okay, I start
And then
over.
you're going to hand it back to me.
All right, I'll do that.
All right.
Okay, what am I saying? I'm saying that I want to thank the president, Saul, for being the first one to recommend my book for publication by Fresno State Press. He was the one that looked at it and said, hey, we've got to publish this. And then sure enough, the other authorities read it and said, yes, we will. We certainly will. And I want to thank all three of these gentlemen and scholars for their contribution to publication of the book, which tells so much about Armenian history and Armenian life, both here and in Armenia and in the Soviet Union. So thank you all for being here, and I'll turn the mic over to my boss.
So why don't you just comment briefly on what prompted you to write the book in the first place, and then we'll go into what the book is and we'll read some of the passages in it. But why do it?
Well, I'm a modest man, and if you're a modest person, you can get a great deal done because no one wants to go up against you. And so when I decided to work for the Armenian cause, my first resolution was not to demand credit for what I was going to do. I was going to do it as a service to us, my people, and I was not going to worry about who got credit for it. That being the case, I did a great deal and no one knew anything about it. Sergio maybe did, but no one else did. And so what I decided I had to do for the sake of the people, not for my own interest, was to write an autobiography. And I think people recognize that even if my autobiography is both humorous and serious, because it has both of these attributes, life is both funny and serious. And if you don't capture those two elements, then you're going to miss a lot about life. So, my dear Mary, what is the first thing I'm allowed to say?
As if I can stop him from saying anything. So what we thought we might do tonight is actually give you a flavor of some of the stories. There's a lot more in here, but we're going to try to go through in a reasonable amount of time. I'm going to read some of the different passages, make a few comments, Dennis will comment on them, just to give you a flavor of a life that the Armenian Research Center piece is at the tail end. It's just the last 25 or 30 years, but it starts in a very different way, and it starts in a way that is both common to so many of us who are Armenian, but each story of the way we came to be here is a little different. And Dennis's led him to Augusta, Georgia, which is not a place where you find many Armenians. And so I want to start with a passage at the beginning. He just calls the first chapter From the Beginning, and it tells the story of his father's passage to America. And I think you'll recognize some of these experiences in those of your own families. My father was born Nahabed Zeronian. His name wasn't screwed up at Ellis Island, like many of his contemporaries, but twice along his journey. Once in Istanbul, then Constantinople, and then again in the good old USA. In the old country, my father's family were iron fabricators in Pendik, one of the seaport suburbs of Istanbul, building machines to service the port. As with most seaports of those days, Pendik was a rough environment, but my father's family managed to do relatively well until the dark days began. Pretty much anyone of any learning knows that the Armenians suffered a catastrophic genocide in the Ottoman Empire from 1915 to 1923. On the eve of the Armenian genocide, as conditions were worsening, my father, like so many of his compatriots, decided to leave the old country with two of his brothers to make a new life in the United States, the land of opportunity. Now, being a man of some imagination, he acquired a forged Greek passport under the name Charlie Papas and fled on a Greek freight ship. Fortunately, Pendik was a busy seaport and its denizens were inclined to speak several languages. In my father's case,
It was Armenian, Turkish, and Greek, and his Greek was of native quality, which made possible his escape. Thus, Nahabet Zarumian became Charlie Papas and bestowed that new surname on his progeny. That was good enough to allow him to take a ship to Piraeus, the seaport of Athens, Greece. From there, he managed to sail to Marseille, France, another jumping-off port of many Armenian refugees, and in 1914, he boarded a ship to New York. In New York, as fortune would dictate, the greenhorns spilled out onto the docks where various predators in the form of headhunters awaited them. These predators represented factories, mills, mines, and foundries with difficult, sometimes dangerous, and always low-paying jobs. For one reason or another, my dad accepted a train ticket to Augusta, Georgia, with the promise of a job in a cotton mill. When he appeared at his place of prospective employment, he took one look at the toxic workplace conditions and walked out. Fortunately, there was a large Greek colony in Augusta, and newcomers were given advice and aid. I am told my father received enough capital to purchase a pushcart to sell fruits and vegetables in the streets to busy housewives. My father was a hardworking and ambitious man, and he soon saved enough money to buy a truck which could hold a greater variety of produce and household essentials, which again he sold door to door. And finally, he was able to purchase a restaurant at the west end of downtown, across the river from South Carolina, called the Busy Bee. It was an American-style working man's establishment, nothing fancy, but it provided us with a decent living. So that's how Papazian, and so when we get asked a lot by people who know Papazians, are you related? I have to explain that no, actually, that's a different story because the name comes from the forged passport. Dennis, do you want to say anything more about life in Augusta and in the South?
Well, not really, but I will say this. The Greeks were very helpful to us, but my father remained a conscious Armenian. His two brothers, one brother married what we would call an Odar today, what some people in those days would call a hillbilly. But that marriage was good, but we sort of drifted apart because they were not pure Armenian, and that was my father's standard. So that situation changed when my uncle married a Greek woman, a widow, and he unfortunately died. I don't want to go into that, but he was a good man, and his wife mourned for him in a very honest and heartful way. Then my father decided he wanted to go back to the old country to marry an Armenian woman. Odar wasn't suitable for him. So he went back to Armenia, and the way I look at it, he had a silver tie pin, or not a silver, a gold tie pin, and he had spats and gold watch, and he cut quite a figure. And so he had what I thought was a lineup of the young, beautiful young girls, 16-year-olds, and my father was probably around 30 by that time. But anyway, he cut quite a figure and persuaded this lovely Armeno Peklivanyan to marry him. And she came over to America with him. And being a very bright young lady, she learned Greek, which was the lingua franca of Augusta, Georgia. And so that marriage produced 4 kids. My brother, 10 years older than I, my 2 sisters, who were older than I, and I was the younger one. So anyway, we had a nice life in Augusta, Georgia, but my mother insisted that we go to where there are Armenians. And my father, who was pro-Armenian, as witness his going back to the old country to find a bride, agreed to it, but it was something that came at the wrong time. It was the end of the time of, what you call it, the Depression. Thank you. The Depression, and so we didn't realize that my mother was actually quite a rich woman because she inherited properties in Istanbul, which are of real value, but we didn't know it. But her brother knew it, and her brother came to the United States several times to visit us and said, look, you can't use those documents, why don't you give them to me? And so we didn't realize that he really meant that, give them to me. He didn't mean, let's share them and I will take care of this. But he went back to the old country with the properties and built 2 apartment buildings, which were worth quite a bit of money, and they should have belonged to my mother, but no, he, being a man, decided he wanted them, and that was it. So we just were denied that privilege. Anyway, let's see, what's the next thing?
So with that, of course, they moved up to Michigan, to Detroit, and a lot of Dennis's life growing up in the Armenian community, of course, happened during that time in Detroit, because it was early Detroit as the Armenian community was coming together, and of course, Alec Manoukian was there, and so many other luminaries, Eddie Mardivian and the like, and so the community was building. But Detroit was a complicated place, and like growing up in, if you realize it, it's the pre-civil rights South. So it's the segregated South. So there's a lot of tension beneath the surface in America throughout all of these years. And where Dennis was, both in the South and in Detroit, he saw some of that. And I think this is important because it's kind of a prelude to what he was going to experience and see in the Armenian community, and really learning how to negotiate that process, where the values are. And I want to read a passage, just to give you a flavor of the Detroit that he knew growing up. The Detroit of my youth was a beautiful city. The crowning glory of the city was Belle Isle, a beautiful island in the Detroit River, which had been turned into an exquisite public park, crowned by an impressive fountain which changed into pastel colors at night. As often as we could, we would drive our car to Belle Isle and park near the fountain to enjoy the view. Detroit had grown rich during the war as the arsenal of democracy, producing everything from trucks, armaments of all types, tanks, and airplanes. Then it was considered a beautiful city of striking avenues, impressive buildings, tree-lined streets, lovely neighborhoods, and a patriotic citizenry. It also was considered a green city, since lovely, mature trees grew along the neighborhood streets. Unfortunately, in the early 1950s, this beauty was to become scarred when the Dutch elm disease eventually wiped out some 3/4 of these lovely shade trees. Whatever the reason, I am convinced that the manipulation of public transportation contributed to Detroit's failure as a city. The electric buses were rotten and weren't dependable or quiet like the streetcars. Disastrous racial relations also contributed to the city's decline. Although Ford was one of the largest regional employers of the black men who came up from the north to escape peonage in the south, black employees of the Ford factories were still subject to de facto housing segregation. Under the National Housing Act of 1934, 2 Ford employees could apply for the same house in the same neighborhood, and one could be denied on the basis of race. One of the jobs Dennis held, by the way, when he came up north and his father had to sell the restaurants at a loss, he was forced to work from a very early age. And one of them was to carry mail at a mutual benefit life insurance company and pick it up from the post office. So this next little vignette is about an experience in the post office that I think really gets at a core value that Dennis has had his whole life. The men at the distribution window at the post office were mostly black. But that didn't surprise me. In order to get a job at the post office, you had to take a civil service examination, and religion, race, or other superficial factors played no role in the hiring. As far as I know, it was a purely merit system, unlike the private corporations, which could do as they wanted. However, I was surprised to find out that most of the post office workers were highly educated and some even had law degrees. They affectionately nicknamed me Doctor, since I was young, bright, and I was just about to begin my education. After I got to know the men at the post office fairly well, I asked why people with advanced education and elegant personalities would take a job moving mail bags. One of the workers, John, held out his hand next to mine. "See, Doctor," he said, "your hand is white and mine is black. In this world, opportunities for blacks are limited, so we come to the post office to get jobs that pay well and give us a decent living. Even though you are a foreigner, if you get a good education and learn good manners, you have a chance to make it. We don't have that chance." His comment hit me very hard. I was born in the South and saw the corrosive impact of segregation firsthand, but I had always assumed that the playing field up north was more level. I had always been ambitious and wanted to succeed in life, but then I realized that I had opportunities that were denied to others. As profoundly unfair as this was, I also understood these opportunities should not be wasted. Little did I realize at that time the impression this made on me as a person. Strengthened by my experience in Georgia and the dignified and accomplished men at the post office, I became conscious of the importance of equal opportunity for all segments of society and tried to institute that in my academic life years later, and indeed in all aspects of my life. I knew it had to be part of my mission to level the unequal playing field in whatever small way I could, even if I wasn't fully conscious of this at the time. And I think it's a set of values that we all understand and embrace, and really drives a lot of that commitment to service and to work and to real opportunity. But I want to juxtapose that story with another one. You gonna do Eleanor Roosevelt? Is that all right? Sure. All right. Yeah. Should I read it? Yeah. Okay. So one of the odd things about Dennis's life is that I sometimes, I used to call him something of a Forrest Gump, right? He sort of ended up in these places that you wouldn't have expected. And along the way, he was at the Union at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, when the candidate for president, John F. Kennedy, came through and effectively announced the Peace Corps. And he was in the audience listening to John F. Kennedy do that. He was one of 12 students across America, college students, invited to the White House to meet President Eisenhower in his later years. But perhaps the story that most he's told me many, many times, and I've told it many, many times, is his interaction with Eleanor Roosevelt. And I want you to keep in mind the story I just read you, these experiences he's had, and how he would have heard what he learned in his private conversation with Eleanor Roosevelt. And this one's a little long, so forgive me, but I think it's worth reading. He was at Wayne State University. It was Wayne University at the time, and not untypical of Dennis, for those of you who've known him for a long time. He was student body president, and he was president of like all the clubs on campus. And the dean had to call him in and say, Dennis, it's great you want to do this, but these are leadership opportunities. We want to nurture leadership in as many students as possible. You can't be president of all of them. And he thought he was helping them, and so he gave up nearly all, but he kept student body president and the Canterbury Club. So those were the two. And well, that's what this one is. Yeah. Okay. So one of the privileges of serving as student government president at Wayne University was to be invited to various student leadership conferences. One of the most interesting of these meetings was the Collegiate Council for the United Nations, which was held at the Bronx campus of Hunter College, known as Hunter in the Bronx. President and Mrs. Roosevelt were strong advocates of the United Nations. The tragedies of World War II were etched on everyone's mind, and another war, we feared, might lead to the total destruction of mankind. Mrs. Roosevelt wanted to build a constituency in the younger generation to ensure a future for the United Nations. She and her idealistic friends, therefore, founded the Collegiate Council for the United Nations, CCUN, which brought college students together to learn about the United Nations, its aspirations, and its possibilities. I will always remember attending a meeting of the CCUN because it left an indelible impression on my mind. I was in my element at such conferences. I love politics, and I love to be politically creative. I vividly remember the magnificent stone buildings and the paneled rooms where I spent some 3 or 4 days actively participating in the organizing events. I remember the occasion clearly because it was one of the first experiences of that kind for me, and because it was there that I had an unexpected private meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt, a revered figure for people of my generation. I have often described with great pride the experience of meeting Mrs. Roosevelt to my wife. The puzzle that faced both of us was that Hunter College, which we came to know as adults, consisted of high-rise buildings in the middle of Manhattan, not the bucolic campus that I remembered. It was not until my wife became the provost at Lehman College, established as part of the City University of New York in 1931 as Hunter in the Bronx, and she invited me on a tour of the campus that I found my Hunter College. That's it, I said with excitement as I saw what is now the music building of the campus with the big carved H on the facade. That's where the meeting was held and where I met Mrs. Roosevelt. So I'm going to drop down just a little bit. The story goes like this. I was actively participating in the Collegiate Council meeting and demonstrating my political acumen, and Dennis is very proud of that, while my Wayne University student government buddies, George Montgomery and Jerry Berg, were back in Michigan. As students, all of us at the meeting were dressed casually with slacks and loud shirts and no ties, which was the style at the time, except for those from the Ivy League, who looked pretty preppy in my eyes. I was having a ball wheeling and dealing until I felt a tap on my shoulder. I looked around and saw an important-looking man dressed in a three-piece tweed suit, who quietly asked if he might speak to me for a moment in private. Not knowing what to expect, but recognizing someone of distinction, I gladly complied. Once we were out of earshot of the other students, the gentleman said, "Mrs. Roosevelt would like to speak to you, young man. Do you mind coming with me?" Of course. I was dumbfounded. Mrs. Roosevelt and President Roosevelt were iconic figures for me and most Americans. "If Mrs. Roosevelt wants to see me, I'll be glad to meet with her," I replied, filled with great curiosity. I had not met with any person of such high distinction as Mrs. Roosevelt in my whole life, and here I was about to have a meeting with her. The distinguished-looking gentleman led me up a flight of stairs to a paneled office where Mrs. Roosevelt, a small but imposing woman with gray blue eyes and a steady gaze, sat with her hands folded on a large wooden desk. I felt like bowing or something, since I was born in the South and brought up to show respect to older women. "Young man, I want to ask you to do me a favor," Mrs. Roosevelt said. "Anything you want, Mrs. Roosevelt," I replied, bewildered. "Anything you want. We've been watching you and decided that you have the skills to have certain articles of the bylaws of the CCUN replaced by the new ones I will give you. Would you do this for me?" "Of course, ma'am," I replied, feeling a touch of pride. "Consider it done." She handed me the list of articles and I ran downstairs. I certainly wouldn't tell Mrs. Roosevelt, but it was relatively easy. I had faced tougher assignments in the past and indeed would face tougher challenges in the future. When the job was done, I once more felt the familiar tap on the shoulder. The distinguished gentleman in the three-piece suit smiled down on me and said once more, "Young man, would you come with me, please?" What now, I thought to myself. What else does she want from me? But I said aloud, "Of course, if Mrs. Roosevelt would like to see me, I am happy to come." And again the man in the three-piece suit led me upstairs to the now familiar paneled office with its hallowed occupant. "Young man," Mrs. Roosevelt said in a warm, grandmotherly voice, "we want to thank you. You did a very impressive job and we appreciate it." "It's nothing, ma'am. I was happy to be of service. Is there anything else I can do for you?" I replied with a big smile on my face. "No, thank you," she said. "But may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course," I replied, proud that she had taken a special interest in me. "Tell me," she inquired, "are you from a wealthy family?" "No, ma'am," I said, taken aback by the question. "Unfortunately, I am not from a wealthy family." "That's too bad," she said in a disappointed tone. Darn right it's too bad, I thought to myself, not knowing what she was getting at. She continued, "You could have had a brilliant career in politics." I must admit, I was a bit offended at this point. I felt that that was contrary to what the United States stood for. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said, politely, but with a little tremor in my voice. "Do you mean to say that only rich people should go into politics?" Precisely, young man, she said. Being in politics requires money, lots of money. If you don't have personal wealth to fall back on, when the time comes when you have to choose between doing the right thing and the expedient thing, you will hesitate, struggle with your conscience, but finally give in to the demands of your supporters. Each time you are confronted with that choice, you will find it a bit easier to do the expedient. Finally, you will no longer be of value to the Commonwealth, since you will have given up those high ideals which I now sense in you. And so, that stayed with Dennis, and when he was asked years later, actually, to run for Congress, he said no, partly because he had Mrs. Roosevelt's words in the back of his mind. And if you think about our politics today, of course, I think you can see the prescience in her words. Perhaps not the solution, but certainly the concern. So let's move you on. Because we could be here all night, and I know we have things to do later. So shall we move on to the story about? You want to go to the Soviet Union, or do you want to do the one story in the University of Michigan Dearborn? University of Michigan Ann Arbor.
Oh, that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, why not?
Okay. He did get a PhD at University of Michigan Ann Arbor, and as a poor student, he had to work to pay tuition. His father died tragically, and you read about it in the book when he was just a boy, and so this was an interesting one. He had an advisor, Andrea Lobona-Verstovsky, and I'll read about that. But Dennis was taking a class. And do you want to explain the Langer thesis first?
Yeah, well, okay, I was taking a class. I wasn't taking the class. I was a reader in a class with a bunch of other readers. And that was the style in those days, and in certain universities even today, that the large lecture halls were 200 or 300 students, and then there were readers who sort of monitored them during examinations, which were, not very personalized. And so I was in the class myself, and I wrote about the Langer thesis. William Langer was a scholar of some note, and who became famous because he used others to do research for him, and then wrote up the research and answered questions which seemed to be unanswerable by other means. And one of these things that he did was to deal with the Armenian genocide, which he did not consider a genocide, because he said the Armenians brought it on themselves because they had these organizations that brought the genocide upon them, because they were organizations that brought concern about the Armenians who had problems, and blamed the problems on the Turks, and the Turks accordingly killed off the Armenians. Well, that is not the real case, as we all know, but that was the Langer thesis, and he was the most prominent historian to deal with this issue, and so they claimed that Langer was correct, and those Armenians who said that the genocide was brought on by the Turks were wrong. And so I wrote that, and I got a B, which for graduate students like a failing grade. And so I went to see Howard Ehrman and said, look, sir, you gave me a B, and what was wrong with my paper? And he said, well, little people shouldn't write their own history. I said, excuse me, do I understand you correctly? That Britishers can write British history, Americans can write American history, Italians can write Italian history, Germans can write German history, but Armenians can't write Armenian history? Precisely, he said. you little people shouldn't try to write your own history because you're not being honest and accurate. And he said, by the way, you're not hired next semester as a reader. Well, that meant that I wasn't going to be in the university because I needed that job to stay in the university. So I went to my mentor, Andrei Lobanov-Rostovsky, who was the prince of the blood of the Russian nobility. And he was very fond of me because he loved my work. And so I went to see him and I said, Dr. Lobanov, I have this problem. And he says, shh, don't speak so loudly. If it comes between a deal of between the department chairman and you, you're out of it, so forget it. He says, so let's be quiet, don't speak so loudly. So I said, fine. So I said, well, what can I do? He says, well, now let me think. Oh, he says, we have a new professor of American history who is Jewish by background and a brilliant man. He says, why don't you go and ask him if you can be a reader in his advanced American history class. I said, excuse me, I don't like modern American history. I like foreign policy, and I have courses in foreign policy. But I really find regular American history a bore. He says, well, quiet, don't speak so loudly. He says, but go to Professor Fine and say that I recommend you to be a teaching fellow in his class. Now, a teaching fellow in an advanced class is a very high-class position. And I said, well, I don't think I can do it. He says, you're ministrable. You can take any position in the ministry and do it successfully. So I said, well, what do I have to lose? Otherwise, I'm out of here. So I went to Professor Fine. I said, Professor Fine, I'd like to speak with you. He says, oh, what do you want to talk about, Papazian? I says, well, I've come from Lobanov-Rostovsky. And I told him this story about Professor Erman, the department chairman, not rehiring me, effectively firing me. And he says, so? He says, Lobanov-Rostovsky told me to come and ask if I could be a teaching fellow in your advanced American history class. He says, Papazian, he says, you've never taken the class. What makes you think you can teach it? I said, well, Professor Fine, to be honest with you, I don't think I can teach it. But Lobanov-Rostovsky thinks I can. And so Fine looked at me, he says, you know, I trust Lobanov-Rostovsky's judgment. You're hired. And so I taught an advanced course in American history as a teaching fellow. And that was quite an experience. It was tough to do, but I did it. And one of the situations is that we had an office for the teaching fellows, and students could come in and ask questions, and so this cute Warren would come in every week.
No, I want to hear that.
You gotta read the book. You gotta read the book. Nothing, I told him, I said, you can't tell everything. So anyway, he stays at the university. That is a good story, though. I do encourage you to have a look at it. But I want to move us along because we know that the night flies by. So Dennis, you know, when you've lived 91 years, it takes a while to get through it, right? The amazing thing, he remembers every story in great detail. What you don't know about that, though, is we have moved 7 4-drawer file cabinets of documents to like 5 different houses across the country with all the records. So everything that's in the book, he has backup material and letters and documents for, just want to say.
But he ends up in the Soviet Union. I want to get us to the Soviet Union because then we have to come back and talk about Armenian things. Is that okay?
Sure.
And that's a whole story too about how he gets to the Soviet Union. Lots of cool stuff there. What we didn't know until relatively recently, as he was writing the book, we kind of put two and two together and realized he had something of a special status in the Soviet Union. Not just as an American student, but he had been asked by the Secret Service when he was still in the United States, before he went over there. They invited him out and they said, would you walk? They said, we have to walk on the street so nobody can hear us. So they walk on the street, and the Secret Service representative, which is higher than the CIA, by the way, says to him, you know, the Soviet Union is a new place. We would love to learn a little bit about what you're experiencing when you're over there. Would you mind sharing your stories with us periodically when you're there? Effectively informing us of what you're learning. And Dennis said, sure, I'd be happy to, why not? And then the gentleman left. He came back the next week and he met with him again and said, you know, he said, thank you for being so willing. We've decided we're not going to do that with students. And so you don't need to worry about it. And but they had found out he was willing. So when he's in Moscow, he became a frequent friend of the Marines at the U.S. Embassy and the representatives at the embassy, and he was able to order things on the diplomatic pouch like the other students weren't able to. He'd just sit every week and have a coffee and a conversation with somebody and tell them all the things he did. So so he was, and because of that, he got this story. Really, I think it gives you a sense of that experience, a little bit of Cold War mood brought in. So let me just read this one. This one's not too long. On my frequent visits to the American Embassy, I befriended the Marines stationed there as guards. They invited me to their Friday night get-togethers, where there were drinks and women from the American Embassy and other international offices. Through one of the Marine friends, I received an invitation to attend the Armistice Day celebration and ball at Spaso House, the home of the American ambassador. It was highly unusual for a Marine guard to be able to extend such an invitation, but I didn't realize it at the time. As I said, the ambassador's house belonged in the old days to a wealthy Moscow merchant, given by the Soviet government to the Americans for use. It was a palace, and quite similar in style and size to the country estates of the landowners of Tsarist Russia. One large room was set aside for the buffet, and another for the ball. There were over 250 people present. The food was delicious, and much of it was imported from abroad. There was Scotch liquor, French champagne, Dutch cakes and beer, Danish ham, turkey, roast beef, salad, fruits, and many other things to eat and drink. The music was exquisite, and everyone seemed to enjoy themselves immensely. It was a formal ball, and a fellow from the East Indies and I were the only men not either in a tuxedo or uniform. Everything was a sight to behold. The people were representatives of all the diplomatic missions in Moscow. The men all looked handsome and the women beautiful. I could have kicked myself for not bringing a tuxedo. I chatted with a Catholic priest, Father Richard, who was the chaplain of the American Roman Catholics living in Moscow. He spoke several languages and we had an interesting conversation together. Among such a distinguished group, I felt a little conspicuous. There was no reason why I should have been there, but I was invited, so I decided to be proud that I was there. Even though it wasn't a tuxedo, the one gray suit I brought to the Soviet Union fit me nicely. The rest of the attendees wore official uniforms dripping in medals. I was noticed, I later learned, by a young lady from the French embassy. She told me later that she noticed that I was one of the younger people there and how I sat up straight in my simple gray suit. It was then that I realized that I was being granted special privileges that none of the other American students enjoyed. Once in a while, I would be taken for a ride in an embassy car with the embassy staff to the airport, where the noise of the engines and airplanes coming and going would make it impossible for the KGB to listen in. We chatted about the people I'd met and the things I'd seen in Moscow and at the university. I never saw anything too unusual, but they didn't know much of anything in those days, so all news was of interest to them. On a frigid night, we were talking in the car, and there was a knock on the window. We rolled it down. Outside was a shivering KGB agent. "Our heater is broken," he said.
can we go back to the city? Should I go back? Should we go back, I asked. Absolutely not, the American official said. So we closed the window and kept on talking. So lots and lots of adventures in Moscow. Dennis wanted to tell the story of the ski jump. Do you want to tell the story of the ski jump?
Sure.
Okay, just briefly though.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We, in the Soviet Union in those days, no one had enough money to have sporting equipment, and so the government provided it, and you leave your passport, and they would give you the device to use. And so one day we wanted to go to the countryside, and so we wanted some cross-country skis. And so my friends and I, about 12 of us, got together and took a train to the countryside, and we went for a wonderful walk in the snow, and we came upon the ski jump. And from the bottom, looking up, it didn't seem like much, as ski jumps often do. And so I said to my friends, let's go and use the ski jump. And they said, no way. You know, these are the cross-country skis. They're not regular skis. And the ski jump looks like it's nothing, but you get up there and it's something. So I said, no, we Americans are brave. This means nothing to us. So, stupidly, I got in line and then walked up the stairs in the back, you know, to our ski jump. And I got to the top, and when it was my turn, I looked out and I saw infinity. I said, oh my gosh, this is not just a little ski jump. This takes you cross-country to the sky. And so the guy behind me realized that I was flabbergasted and didn't know what I was doing. And he felt sorry for me. And so he said, when you jump, squat. And I didn't quite understand that, but finally when it was my turn and I took off, I was scared half to death. And so I squatted. And sure enough, I made a 3-point landing. My bottom and 2 skis. And my bottom ripped off the pants, and the guys had to come and wrap me in a blanket and take me back to the train. So that was my experience. And so we took the train back, handed in the skis, got back our passes, and went up to a room and got royally drunk. So that's the story of my ski jump. Okay, Mary, back to you.
He really wanted to tell that story. He said, it's a great story. But you know what? It's another one of those close calls. Dennis has a lot of these close calls. And I want to take Sergio mentioned the airplane crash. You know, when we would tell our daughters about this when they were small, or one of our daughters was really afraid of flying. And I would say, don't worry, Dad's with us, Daddy's with us. And how many people do you know get into 2 air crashes in their life? And so that really comforted my daughter. She said, oh, okay, that's right, it'll be okay. One time we were traveling and she wasn't with us. He wasn't with us, it was just us. And she said, what are we gonna do? Dad's not with us. So it backfired, she got really scared on that flight. But we made it. But it started out, the journey, really, it was the end of his time in Moscow. And he was gonna take a trip around the world. And he had thick tickets, and he was going to go into Central Asia, which was it's still today, is still a kind of unknown place, but it was a very rich historical place from the old Silk Roads from the past. And so he was going to go to Tashkent, and to Bukhara, and to Samarkand, really incredible places. But being the Soviet Union of the early 1960s, he couldn't travel by himself. So he was sent with a translator. And this is Tair. Dennis says, why a translator? We all speak Russian. He says, yes, you speak Russian, they said, but you don't speak Turkish. And so that's how they got him. So Tair went and he said, You travel by yourself, and I'm going to go see my girlfriend in Tashkent, and then we'll travel back together. But wait for me, from Bukhara, but wait for me. Don't get on the plane without me, or we'll both get into bad trouble. We have we actually put in the book a postcard that Dennis sent the day before the airplane crash, where he talks about the incredible experience, having a wonderful time. Bukhara is a great, historic city. And then he's waiting at the airport, no Tahir, and the flight they were supposed to take leaves. And then the next flight, and this I'll read, it's just a couple of paragraphs here. The next flight was an already overcrowded Ilyushin 14. This particular Soviet model was a twin propeller plane made as a copy of the American DC-3. Many of the big shots who attended the Bukhara celebration were on our flight to the capital city as well. Tahir and I squeezed into 2 seats over the wing. I took the window seat, still wearing my sunglasses. The tarmac sparkled under the blazing Uzbek sky. We were about 30 minutes in flight when I noticed oil drip, drip, dripping out of the engine cowl. I called over the Aeroflot stewardess and pointed out to her what I was seeing through my window. The engine is dying, I said. You had better tell the pilot that we need to land in the river. Next to the river. She went to speak with him and came back a few minutes later. He thinks we can make it, she said with a nervous laugh. The pilot would not like to inconvenience the important guests on the plane. A little while after, I noticed that the pilot had turned off the engine next to me and feathered the propeller, which meant that he was trying to reduce wind resistance. I called the flight attendant a second time. The American would like the pilot to land the plane, I said, excited. The pilot thinks we can make it with 1 engine, she said. I looked out the window next to me as the tree-dotted landscape below. The plane would have to climb to get to Tashkent, since it was of a higher elevation than Bukhara or Samarkand. It was still light outside, and I could see the Sir Darya River below, winding its way through the desert. Put on your seatbelt, I said to Tahir, and put your head on your knees. We huddled in crash position and waited, but nothing happened. I sat up to look at the window, and my head smashed into the window. The plane struck a high-tension wire 30 miles from Tashkent. The plane split in half, and Tahir and I tumbled out like egg yolks. I am not sure how many survived the crash, but I was later told by some who visited the site that most people on board died. Somehow he made it, and spent a couple of months in a Uzbeki hospital and then in a collective farm recuperating before making it back to the United States, at which the next phase of his life goes. And it's at that point that he takes his first job as a professor of history at what would become the University of Michigan Dearborn, helps build that campus, and lots of stories for those who like academic administration, for you, Sergio, about building a university from the ground up, basically. But like all things, when you're building, sometimes you have to do things quickly. And if you've ever been I'm looking at you, Micah, think about it, trying to change curriculum in a year and get all faculty on board. Some people don't like it at the end of the year. And so, he did his work, he built the place, and then it was time to leave. But as we like to say, when the door closes, a window opens. So I want to share one small story of a person who had a profound influence in Dennis's life on him, and that's Alec Manoogian. Of course, remember, Dennis grew up in Detroit, and so Alec Manoogian was a towering figure in the very years of his youth. And Dennis was very close to Alex. He was chair of the Cultural Fund for about 10 years, and actually traveled with him once to Yerevan. Well, I'm going to speak about, he traveled with him many times to many places, including Jerusalem. But this one is this really great little story. It's a little vignette into the way Manoogian thought and why he was so successful, and the role he played in really supporting the Armenian church and Armenian institutions at a time prior to independence. This is during the Soviet times, when it was a very, very difficult thing to do. He said,
Manoukian's genius lay in his determination to resurrect the Armenian people after the genocide, to rebuild the church, to encourage a free and independent Armenia, and to help our people return to their rightful place in the family of nations. In Armenia, then a part of the USSR, he directed the renovation of the holy site of Echmiadzin. The church in Armenia was being suppressed under communism, and the Veharan, or Palace of the Catholicosate, had been occupied by Soviet army officers. Manoukian built new housing for the officers and retrieved the palace for its original use. I flew with Manoukian to Armenia for the Veharan renovations. He had ordered a chandelier for the Catholicos' palace from Czechoslovakia, which was famous for its crystal. When the package arrived from Prague, there were 2 ornate, humongous chandeliers inside. "Why 2, Mr. Manoukian?" I asked. "We only needed 1. "One for the Veharan," Manoukian explained, "and 1 for the government." He knew how to get things done. And with that then, as Dennis left, took a leave of absence, he's the only person who I know who was able to take a 4-year leave of absence from the university. He didn't plan that, but it really was on the heels of the establishing of the Armenian Assembly. And Dennis was one of the people right at those early days. And as he tells it here, the first assembly took place in 1971 at Airlie House. And one of the most remarkable things about a life like Dennis's is that so many of the institutions that we all know and have come to take for granted didn't exist. Armenian studies didn't exist. Armenian political power didn't exist in his childhood and in his young adulthood. And it wasn't until his early adult life and into his maturity that those institutions that we all depend on were being built. Airlie was an idyllic setting for this meeting. Some of us were meeting for the first time, some were lifelong adversaries, reuniting and engaging in discussion. At one point during the conference, one of the attendees, a bearded man who drove a Rolls Royce with a vanity plate with his name on it, whispered to me that the conference was bugged. "Well, we had better not talk in here," I said. We later learned that Airlie indeed was a CIA facility. Working in small groups, we had an open and frank discussion about building Armenian cultural identification, communication between local groups, and establishing Armenian political power in the United States. In particular, how to make the Armenian political system more responsive to the needs of the Armenian-American community. By failing to organize politically, we agreed we Armenians were missing significant opportunities to generate public support for important programs and to make our people more visible and effective. The Assembly endorsed a new framework for communication and organization for the Armenian-American community and to help Armenians protect their own basic human rights. John Hanessian named me the conference chairman for the final session. Speaking to the room of luminaries, I expressed my hopes and desires that the spirit of Airlie, the spirit of tolerance, acceptance, and cooperation would spread throughout the Armenian communities. We were sure that the Assembly had been a success. And partially successful and partially not. John Hanessian, of course, who was a great figure and first mover in the Assembly, died tragically, some of you may remember, in 1974 of an air crash himself. It was a Turkish Airlines over Orly Airport in Paris, and it was a big loss. And with John's passing, what ended up happening is they turned to Dennis and asked him to move to Washington and to take on building the Armenian Assembly. And so that's what he did, and was there for 4 years. And much of the work was very foundational, really introducing Armenian issues, working with people like Tip O'Neill and others. Tip was a very powerful Speaker of the House at the time, and so much more. But Dennis, there's 2 initiatives that Dennis was really the mover on that were very profound for the Armenian community. And I want to just reference both of them. One is the Aid to Lebanon project. And there may be some folks in here who are from Lebanon or know people from Lebanon. You remember back in the 70s during the Civil War, Armenians were under threat.
and had great needs. And so Dennis had the idea that the funding through the USAID could help support projects to support Armenians in Lebanon, in Beirut. Now, the only organization that could take these funds from the U.S. government was an organization that had been audited by one of the main audit firms, and the only one there was the AGBU. So they became the lead, but the other organizations were also a part of it. And there's a great moment when Dennis goes over, and they get this money. It's equivalent of $1 million today, and they decide that they're going to use it not by giving the money out, but by actually creating what later becomes known as a microloan program. So they would loan the money to small business, mostly women who had lost husbands. They were widows through the war, and to help them start their businesses, could be sewing or whatever else it was, and then they would pay back those monies. And that money actually sort of lasted for decades. But the U.S. government wasn't so happy about it. And there's a couple of amazing things here. First, that Dennis got money from the U.S. government at a time when nobody knew about it. That he got it for Armenians in Lebanon, which is, again, you couldn't get it for specific people. So what they had to do was identify a region, and the region they identified was Burj-Shamut, which was predominantly Armenian, and that was the way they got around that. And so every hurdle that was there, Dennis was able to figure out a way around it until that came to be. And the microloan program was set to a fund to help breadwinners, business owners, individuals rebuild, purchase tools and equipment and merchandise, or even start a new business in the field. Almost half of those who accepted our loans had their businesses destroyed in the fighting, and the microloans allowed them to rebuild. And this was critical to the survival of the Armenian community in Lebanon. In those days, and this is what's also pretty cool, what they set up was unprecedented, and the U.S. government representatives were saying, you've got to spend the money. We give money away. We don't want you to keep it. And Dennis would say, no, we're going to do it this way. So in those days, the policy of the U.S. State Department required that aid monies be dispersed and grants closed. Their idea was to give away $500,000 in the neighborhoods. The Armenians, however, wanted to make the money last and to make the program continue indefinitely. Panos was the head of the project in Lebanon. He was a representative of the AGBU. Representative, yeah. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Close connection and friendship with W. Ernst Pop, the USAID Lebanon project officer, staved off trouble in Lebanon while I placated AID in Washington. Much of my professional correspondence from those years is my arguing with the State Department since I refused to give away the money. It is interesting to note that finally it was the State Department that changed its policies and not our Aid to Lebanon program. In other words, we Armenians set an example in Burj-Shamut that was eventually followed all over the world by the United States government. Late in life, Pop wrote Panos a letter where he remembered our work together. I am totally aware of one of the important episodes in your distinguished service to the Joint Aid to Lebanon program that was sponsored by the USAID during the Lebanese Civil War and carried out under the auspices of the Armenian General Benevolent Union. Your small loan fund was unique at that time, and since then has become the standard operating procedure for such aid programs. In other words, you established a new pattern for American aid programs throughout the world. I commend you for your significant contribution to the success of the program, etc. So that's a really great thing. The last piece on this that was a tidbit I didn't know until Dennis wrote the book is that not only did Dennis get this money from the U.S. government, he went over to Lebanon a couple of times during the program, which I knew, but I didn't know that he went to take a special message to the head of the Maronite forces, of the Phalange. Due to my connections and prestige in Washington, I was chosen as one of the conduits to relay the message of protection from the United States to the leaders of the Christian-controlled right-wing Lebanese forces known as the Phalange in Lebanon. Local leaders arranged for me to meet with the head of the Phalange forces, either Pierre or his son Bachir Jamael, at the palace of the Armenian Holy See in Cilicia. They arrived in big cars with machine gunners jumping out to protect their leader. When we spoke, I told him that I presumed that he had received a message from the United States, that the Armenians of Lebanon were under the protection of the American government, and that he agreed with that policy, which seemed eminently reasonable. He agreed that it was reasonable and that as long as the Armenians were not aiding the Arabs, the Phalange was satisfied. And we know that was that important neutrality that the Armenians protected during that period of history. The other event, some of you may remember back in 1978, the National Geographic published an incredible spread called The Proud Armenians. What you may not know is that that was Dennis's idea and he facilitated that to happen. He had contacts and he had the idea, he says, of inspiring an article on Armenians in the National Geographic. And so with the work of Harry Melchayan, who was a great photographer with the Washington Post, they put together the program that became The Proud Armenians. And it was an incredible story, something that I think brought pride to a community that had never seen a positive story about itself. The stories had always been about loss, about victimization, about tragedy, about genocide, about starvation, not about success and thriving and triumphing in various fields. If you go back and you read that article, that piece today, it's a pretty amazing story. And this is 1978, and again, that was Dennis's idea. A lot of people don't know that. So I guess that's why you wrote the book, right, Dennis? So they know that those were your ideas. I know we're kind of running a little toward the end of our time. I'm looking at Barlow for a sense of that. We can always go on, but I've got a couple more things I'd love to do here, if I can.
Briefly, and then we'll open up.
Perfect. Okay. Well, there's so much more. I could talk about, or Dennis could talk about his life as a professor. He could talk about, all the contributions Armenians make. I did promise you a passage about bringing Taner Akjam to America. I'd like to read that, and then I'd like to read parts of his very important speech he gave on the 70th anniversary of the First Republic. And with that, we'll open it up for questions if that's okay. There's a lot more, but you've got to have something to read, right? So let me just read this. Since Taner's your guest next week, I thought it would be really great to read this part. Okay, let's just get to the right place. Okay. One day, I received a phone call from Professor Vahak Dadrian, my colleague and the well-known expert on the Armenian genocide, telling me I should watch the 1997 English-language Dutch film, Wall of Silence. The film was about Vahak meeting Taner Akjam, a Turkish scholar who acknowledged the reality of the Armenian genocide. As a young man in Turkey, Taner had been arrested for radicalism and sentenced to 10 years in a Turkish prison. After serving 1 year of his sentence, Taner escaped to West Germany. There he became a scholar at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, studying the history of violence and torture in Turkey. Wall of Silence was a documentary film about the unlikely friendship that formed between Akjam and Dadrian, a friendship that chipped away at the Turkish government's official policy of denial of the Armenian genocide. Even the fact that these two individuals, a full-blooded Armenian and a full-blooded Turk, could connect was earth-shaking, a real cause célèbre at the time. Vahak recommended that I bring Taner to my research center as scholar in residence. I've always considered myself a trailblazer, but the idea of inviting a Turkish scholar to my research center seemed beyond the pale. What would, I wondered, the Knights of Vartan and my Armenian supporters think? I watched the film and found it enlightening and inspiring. It touted Akjam as a sincere and expert researcher on the question of the genocide, and apparently a person worthy of supporting. Mary and I, that's me, agreed to invite Taner as a scholar in residence at the Armenian Research Center, but only for 2 months. I wanted to wait until I got to know him better to decide if I should invite him longer. Taner understood that I was hesitant to invite him for exactly that reason. In 2021, 2 decades after our first meeting, he told me that when he first arrived, he tried to use the dictionary to tell me in English. He didn't speak any English at the time. You will not be disappointed. You won't regret inviting me. I owe you a lot. And one of the things he did, what Tanner says he remembers from those early days, he reminded him of how I organized a talk for him and advised him to bring his books, all of which were in Turkish. He gave a lecture in broken English, and then I walked around the room and sold 100 books to Armenians who couldn't read Turkish. We need to buy all of these books to support his research, I said. You have to have them for souvenirs. These are rare items. And we all know the story of Tanner and what he has done for the Armenians since then.
We're going back a few years.
That's right, that's right. So the last thing I wanna, and actually I think what I'll do, Barlow, is take some questions and then we'll close with the speech. Because it's great last words to have ringing in your ears. So why don't we open it up for some questions, and then the speech will take about 3-4 minutes for me to read when it's done. So we'll open it up. Yeah, Steve.
So I picked up the book this last summer at the Grand Convocation, and I'm not an avid book reader.